In the chaos of Civil War Virginia, a small town's church became the stage for one of the most chilling mysteries in American history. 14 girls vanished after a reverend's secret baptisms, leaving behind only coded journals, photographs, and a trail of silence that lasted for decades. What really happened in that locked stone chamber beneath the church? Tonight on Dark Diaries, we uncover the secrets that even war couldn't erase. In the spring of 1863, in a small Virginia town torn apart by the Civil War, a Methodist reverend introduced a baptism ceremony that required young girls to remove every piece of clothing before entering the water. Reverend Josiah Webb called it complete purification, and he insisted it was the only way to wash away the stains of war that clung to their souls. The ceremonies took place behind locked doors in a stone chamber beneath the church with no witnesses except his elderly blind wife. Over the course of 18 months, 73 girls between the ages of 12 and 16 underwent this ritual. 14 of them vanished within weeks of their baptism, gone without a trace, their disappearances explained away as placements with distant families or job opportunities in other cities. No one questioned it at the time. The war had made disappearances common. But in 1889, when demolition workers tore down the abandoned church, they discovered something hidden in that baptistry chamber. 73 journals written in cipher, dozens of photographs, and financial ledgers documenting payments that connected Reverend Webb to addresses across the northern states. What really happened during those ceremonies? What did Webb do in that locked room that required such elaborate documentation and secrecy? And where did those 14 girls actually go? Before we uncover the disturbing truth about Reverend Josiah Webb and what happened in that baptistry, I need you to do something. If mysteries like this fascinate you, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Also, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. I want to know how far these dark historical tales reach. The answers to those questions would remain buried for over 2 decades, hidden behind the chaos of war, and protected by the silence of those who knew the truth but chose to look away. Heardsville sat 15 miles south of the Rappahannock River, right along the fault line where Virginia tore itself apart. It wasn't large enough to matter strategically, which made it perfect for people who wanted to disappear. Before the war, it had been a modest farming community of about 800 souls, tobacco growers mostly with a few craftsmen and a general store that doubled as the post office. By 1863, that population had swollen to nearly 2,000, bloated with refugees fleeing the fighting that consumed the countryside like a slow-moving plague. The town had no clear allegiance. Some families sent sons to wear Confederate gray. Others quietly supported the Union and waited for the Northern armies to arrive. Most people just tried not to starve. The war had turned the surrounding farmland into a wasteland of trampled crops, burned barns, and unmarked graves. Refugees arrived weekly, mostly women and children, whose men had died or vanished into the armies. They came with nothing but the clothes on their backs and stories that made grown men weep. The Methodist church stood on the eastern edge of town, a modest whitewashed building with a simple steeple and narrow windows that seemed to squint against the sun. It had been built in 1841 with lumber from local pines, and by 1863 it was beginning to show its age. The paint was peeling, the floorboards creaked, and there was a persistent smell of mildew that no amount of airing could eliminate. But it was still a church, and in a time when everything else was falling apart, that meant something. Reverend Josiah Webb had arrived in Heardsville in late 1862, shortly after the Battle of Fredericksburg had sent thousands of displaced civilians streaming south into Virginia's interior. He came with impeccable references from the Methodist Episcopal Church and a letter of introduction from a bishop in Richmond. He was 53 years old, tall and spare, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from hickory. His voice, when he preached, had a quality that made people lean forward in their pews, not loud, but penetrating, as if he were speaking directly into your skull. He brought with him his wife, Constance, a woman of 60-some years, who had been blind since childhood. She was small and moved with the careful precision of someone who had long ago mapped the world through touch and sound. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice was surprisingly strong. She attended every service, sitting in the front pew with her hands folded in her lap, her milky eyes fixed on some point beyond the congregation. Webb's theology was strict but not unusual for the time. He preached hellfire and redemption, sin and salvation, the eternal struggle between flesh and spirit. What set him apart was his intensity when he spoke about purity. He would stand at the pulpit, gripping its edges until his knuckles went white, and talk about how the war was God's punishment for a nation steeped in moral corruption. He said the suffering would continue until people were washed clean, truly clean, stripped of every stain. "The Lord sees through our pretenses," he would say, his eyes sweeping across the congregation. "He sees the rot beneath the cloth, the filth clinging to the skin. We cannot hide from his gaze. We must expose ourselves completely before him, naked as the day we were born, and beg for his mercy." It made people uncomfortable, but in a way that felt holy. This was 1863. Death was everywhere. Comfort was for people who didn't understand how bad things had gotten. The church quickly became a refuge for the displaced families flooding into Harrodsville. Webb organized relief efforts, distributed donated food, and helped arrange housing for those who had nowhere to go. He was particularly attentive to the young girls who arrived without parents. Orphans of the war, most of them their fathers dead in battle, their mothers succumbed to disease or starvation. There were so many of them that the church set up a temporary dormitory in the back rooms supervised by a rotating group of local women. Among these women was Mrs. Abigail Tinsley, a widow in her 40s whose husband had died at First Manassas. She had a lined face and suspicious eyes, and she didn't trust Reverend Webb from the beginning. "There's something wrong in how he looks at those girls," she told her sister one evening in August of 1863. "Not lustful exactly, more like he's studying them, like they're specimens." But Mrs. Tinsley was in the minority. Most people in Harrodsville saw Webb as a godsend. He was organizing charity at a time when the Confederate government had collapsed into dysfunction, and the Union Army was still months away from restoring order. He asked for nothing in return except devotion to God and participation in the church's rituals. It was in October of 1863 that Webb introduced what he called the ceremony of complete purification. He announced it during Sunday service, standing before a congregation of nearly 300 people packed into pews meant for half that number. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and wet wool. Outside, rain drummed steadily on the roof. "The baptism we have practiced until now is insufficient," Webb said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. "We sprinkle water on the forehead and call it done. But the stains of this war go deeper than the skin. They seep into the very fabric of our garments. They cling to us like sin itself." He paused, letting the silence build. "The young women who have come to us from the battlefields have witnessed horrors that would break a grown man. They have seen things that corrupt the soul. If we are to save them, truly save them, we must perform a baptism that leaves nothing hidden, a full immersion in sanctified water with no barriers between flesh and grace. The body must be as naked before God as the soul." The congregation erupted in murmurs. Some people nodded slowly. Others looked appalled. Webb raised a hand and the noise subsided. "I understand your concerns," he continued. "This is why the ceremony will be conducted in absolute privacy in the baptistry chamber below the church. No men will be present except myself, and my wife Constance will serve as witness, to ensure all propriety is maintained. The girls will be given robes to wear before and after. Nothing untoward will occur. This is about salvation, not scandal." He looked directly at Mrs. Tinsley as he said this, as if daring her to object. She said nothing, but her jaw tightened. The baptistry had been installed in 1859 during a brief period of Methodist revivalism that swept through central Virginia. It was located in a stone chamber beneath the church, accessible only through a narrow staircase behind the altar. The chamber was about 12 feet square with a sunken pool in the center lined with slate. The water was supplied by a hand pump connected to a nearby well, and it was always cold, bone-deep cold, even in summer. The chamber had no windows. The only light came from oil lamps mounted on the walls, and their flames cast shifting shadows that made the space feel smaller than it was. The ceiling was low enough that a tall man would have to stoop. The air smelled of damp stone and something else, something faintly organic, like mushrooms growing in the dark. Webb insisted that the baptistry remained locked at all times, except during ceremonies. He kept the only key on a cord around his neck. The first girl to undergo the ceremony of complete purification was a 14-year-old named Sarah Routledge. She had arrived in Harrodsville 3 weeks earlier, alone after walking nearly 40 miles from a farm near Chancellorsville. Her parents and 2 younger brothers had been killed when Union cavalry burned their property during a foraging expedition. Sarah had hidden in a root cellar and survived, but when she emerged, there was nothing left. She was small for her age, with dark hair and eyes that seemed too large for her face. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. The women of the church had taken her in, fed her, given her clean clothes, but she remained distant, locked inside herself. Webb had spoken to her privately several times. He told her that her suffering was a test from God, and that if she passed through the fire of purification, she would emerge stronger. He told her that the ceremony would wash away everything she had seen, everything that haunted her dreams. He told her that she would finally be able to sleep. On the evening of October 17, 1863, just after sunset, Webb led Sarah down the stairs into the baptistery. His wife Constance followed, moving carefully, one hand on the stone wall. The door closed behind them with a sound like a coffin sealing. No one else was present. The ceremony, according to Webb's later written account, lasted 45 minutes. Sarah was instructed to remove all her clothing and place it in a basket by the door. She was then led into the pool where Webb submerged her 3 times while reciting passages from Ezekiel and Revelation. Constance stood nearby, her blind eyes fixed on nothing, her hands clasped in prayer. When it was finished, Sarah was given a rough towel and a clean robe. She dressed in silence. Webb made notes in a small leather journal he always carried. Then they returned upstairs. Mrs. Tinsley was waiting in the church when they emerged. She watched Sarah's face carefully. The girl looked pale but not distressed. She moved like someone in a dream. When Mrs. Tinsley asked if she was all right, Sarah nodded but didn't speak. Over the following weeks, 7 more girls underwent the ceremony. All of them were orphans or refugees. All of them were between 12 and 16. Webb kept meticulous records of each baptism in his journal, though he never showed these records to anyone. The girls who went through the ceremony seemed changed afterward. Some became withdrawn, speaking even less than before. Others developed a strange devotion to Webb, following him around the church like shadows. A few began having nightmares, screaming in their sleep, thrashing in their beds until the other girls had to hold them down. Mrs. Tinsley tried to raise concerns with the church elders, but they dismissed her. "You're letting your imagination run wild," one of them told her. "The Reverend is a man of God. Those girls are traumatized by the war, not by him. Be grateful someone is trying to help them." But then the disappearances began. The first was in December of 1863. A girl named Martha Good, 15 years old, vanished overnight from the church dormitory. Her bed was empty when the other girls woke up. Her few possessions, a small wooden cross, a pair of worn shoes, were gone. It looked like she had simply packed up and left. Webb announced it during the following Sunday's service. "Martha has been called to service elsewhere," he said. "A family in Richmond has agreed to take her in as a housemaid. It's a blessing for her, a chance at a new life. Let us pray for her success." The congregation prayed. No one questioned it. 2 months later, another girl disappeared, then another. By the summer of 1864, 6 girls had vanished from the church, all of them within months of undergoing the purification ceremony. Each time Webb had the same explanation. They had been placed with families elsewhere, or they had found work in cities, or they had been reunited with distant relatives. He always had a plausible story, and no one had reason to doubt him, except Mrs. Tinsley. She began keeping her own records, writing down the names of the girls and the dates they disappeared. She noticed a pattern. All of them had been baptized in the chamber below the church. All of them had gone through the ceremony alone with Webb and his blind wife, and all of them had developed that strange, distant demeanor in the weeks afterward. She tried to speak to some of the remaining girls about what happened during the baptism, but they refused to talk. When she pressed them, they would look away, their faces closing like shutters. One night in July of 1864, Mrs. Tinsley followed Webb when he descended into the baptistery. She waited until she heard the door close, then crept down the stairs and pressed her ear against the wood. She could hear voices, Webb's low murmur, a girl's quiet sobbing, the splash of water. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to make her stomach turn. She reported what she heard to the town constable, a man named Illy Vance. He was skeptical. "You heard a girl crying during a baptism," he said. "That's not exactly evidence of wrongdoing. People cry when they're moved by the Spirit. This wasn't spirit." Mrs. Tinsley said this was fear. But Vance did nothing. He was a deacon in Webb's church. He wasn't about to accuse his own reverend of impropriety based on secondhand sounds through a door. By the end of 1864, 14 girls had disappeared from Harrodsville's Methodist Church. 14 names in Mrs. Tinsley's records. 14 families who had supposedly claimed them, though no one could produce letters or addresses. 14 young women who had undergone the ceremony of complete purification and then vanished into the chaos of a collapsing nation. And then in January of 1865, the Union Army arrived. The occupation of Harrodsville by Union forces changed everything, but not in the way Mrs. Tinsley had hoped. The Federal troops who marched into town in the bitter cold of January 1865 were exhausted, underfed, and in no mood to investigate the disappearance of Confederate girls. To them, Harrodsville was just another half-starved Southern town, full of people who had brought their suffering upon themselves. Major William Garrett, the Union officer assigned to establish martial law in the area, set up headquarters in the town's only hotel and issued a series of proclamations. All firearms were to be surrendered. All able-bodied men were to report for questioning regarding possible Confederate sympathies. All churches would remain open, but subject to federal oversight. When Mrs. Tinsley brought her concerns about Reverend Webb to Major Garrett, he listened with the expression of a man who had heard every possible grievance 100 times before. "You're telling me this Methodist preacher made some girls take their clothes off for baptism?" Garrett said, leaning back in his chair. "And then they ran off." "They didn't run off," Mrs. Tinsley insisted. "They disappeared. 14 of them, all orphans, all within months of his ceremony." Garrett said slowly, "This is a war zone. People disappear every day. Most of them are dead in a ditch somewhere, or they moved on looking for food. You're asking me to investigate a preacher for conducting unusual religious rites in a Methodist church. Do you have any idea how many things I have to deal with that actually matter?" "Those girls matter," Mrs. Tinsley said. "I'm sure they do. But unless you can show me a body or a witness who will testify to an actual crime, there's nothing to investigate." Mrs. Tinsley left the hotel with her hands shaking. She had expected the Union to bring justice, to care about what happened to Southern girls. She had been foolish. The war ended 4 months later. By then, Harrodsville had been blood dry. The congregation at Webb's church had dwindled to fewer than 100 people. The dormitory for refugee girls had closed. Reverend Webb continued to preach to smaller and smaller audiences, and his sermons grew darker, more apocalyptic. He spoke about the judgment that was coming, about how God would separate the pure from the corrupt, about how only those who had been truly washed clean would be saved. In August of 1865, Webb's wife Constance died. The official cause was recorded as heart failure, but people whispered that she had simply stopped eating. She was buried in the church cemetery, and Webb read the service himself in a voice so flat it was like listening to someone recite a grocery list. After her death, Webb stopped performing the purification ceremonies. The baptistry below the church was locked, and it remained locked. Webb seemed to age rapidly in the months that followed. His hair went from gray to white. His face became gaunt. His hands developed a tremor. He moved through the church like a ghost, performing the rituals of ministry with mechanical precision. In the spring of 1866, he announced that he was leaving Harrodsville. He had been reassigned to a church in North Carolina, he said, and would be departing within the week. The remaining congregation gave him a modest farewell, and he left on a Tuesday morning, driving a wagon loaded with his possessions. He took everything from the parsonage: furniture, books, personal items. He left nothing behind except the church itself. Mrs. Tinsley watched him go from her porch and felt a mix of relief and frustration. She had spent 3 years trying to prove that something terrible had happened in that church, and she had failed. Webb was gone. The girls were gone. Whatever truth had existed was now scattered across the South that would spend the next decade trying to rebuild itself from ashes. The Methodist Church in Harrodsville continued to operate, but attendance dwindled. People had lost their taste for religion during the war. Or maybe they had just lost their taste for that particular building. A new Reverend arrived in 1867, a young man from Pennsylvania who preached about reconciliation and renewal. He tried to revitalize the congregation, but it was like trying to grow flowers in salted earth. By 1870, the church was holding services only twice a month. By 1875, it had closed entirely. The building sat vacant for years, slowly deteriorating. The paint peeled away in long gray strips. The windows broke, birds nested in the rafters. The door to the baptistry chamber remained locked, and no one bothered to open it. Mrs. Tinsley died in 1878, still bitter about the girls who had disappeared and the justice that had never come. She left her records, her lists of names and dates with her sister, who regarded them as evidence of Abigail's obsessive nature, rather than documentation of a real crime. The papers eventually ended up in a trunk in an attic, forgotten. The town of Harrodsville itself never fully recovered from the war. Its population continued to shrink as younger people moved away to cities where there were jobs and futures. By 1885, fewer than 300 people remained. The abandoned church became a local curiosity, a place that children dared each other to enter at night, though none of them ever made it farther than the front steps. It might have stood there forever, crumbling slowly into the Virginia soil, except that in the spring of 1889, a man named Thomas Greer purchased the property. Thomas Greer was not from Virginia. He was a former Union Army captain from Massachusetts who had stayed in the South after the war ended, working first as a railway surveyor and later as a real estate speculator. He had a practical mind and a nose for opportunity. When he saw that the old Methodist church in Harrodsville was sitting on a half-acre of land near the main road, he recognized its value. The building itself was worthless, a rotting shell that would have to be torn down, but the land could be subdivided and sold. He purchased the property for $30 from the Methodist Episcopal Church's regional office, which was happy to be rid of it. The deed was signed on March 3, 1889. Greer hired a demolition crew from Richmond, 5 men with sledgehammers and crowbars, and gave them simple instructions. Tear it down. Salvage anything valuable, burn the rest. The crew arrived on March 18th. They started with the roof, pulling off shingles and prying loose the beams. The interior was musty and filled with the nests of birds and rodents. The pews had been removed years earlier, but the pulpit was still there, along with a few pieces of broken furniture. They worked methodically, reducing the structure piece by piece. On the afternoon of March 20th, one of the workers, a man named Henry Coulter, discovered the door to the baptistry. It was behind the altar, covered by a piece of fallen timber and easy to miss. The door was made of heavy oak and secured with a rusted iron lock. Coulter called to the foreman, "There's something down here." Locked door. The foreman, a thick-shouldered man named Davidson, came over to look. He tried the handle. The lock held. "Probably just a cellar," he said. "Break it open." Coulter used a crowbar. The lock was old and the wood around it was soft with rot. It took 3 hard strikes before the door gave way with a crack like a breaking bone. The stairs beyond descended into darkness. The air that came up smelled of mildew and something else, something faintly sweet and unpleasant, like old flowers left too long in water. Davidson sent Coulter down with a lantern. The other workers gathered at the top of the stairs, curious. Coulter's voice came up from below, echoing in the stone chamber. "It's some kind of pool, and hold on. There's a lot of stuff down here." "What kind of stuff?" Davidson called. "Books, boxes. Looks like someone stored a bunch of things." Davidson descended the stairs, followed by 2 other workers. The baptistry was exactly as Josiah Webb had left it 23 years earlier. The pool was dry now, its slate bottom covered with a layer of dust. The oil lamps were still mounted on the walls, though their reservoirs were empty, and against the far wall, stacked in neat rows, were dozens of wooden crates and metal trunks. The workers pried open the first crate. Inside were ledgers, heavy books bound in leather, their pages filled with names, dates, and notations in a cramped, precise handwriting. Davidson flipped through one at random. The entries made no immediate sense. They seemed to be records of some kind, but the language was strange, full of abbreviations and coded terms. The second crate contained journals, 73 of them, each one numbered and dated. The handwriting was the same as in the ledgers. The entries were longer, more detailed, but written in a cipher that rendered them unreadable. The third crate contained something that made Davidson stop and stare. Photographs, dozens of them taken with an early camera, printed on heavy paper that had yellowed with age. The images showed young girls, some standing, some sitting, all of them looking directly at the camera with expressions that ranged from fear to blank resignation. They were wearing simple white robes and their hair was wet. Davidson felt his stomach turn. He looked at the other workers. "Get Mr. Greer now." Thomas Greer arrived within the hour. He descended into the baptistry and examined the contents of the crates in silence. He picked up one of the journals, flipped through its indecipherable pages, set it down. He looked at the photographs for a long time, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Pack everything up carefully. I want it all brought to my office. And don't talk about this to anyone." The workers obeyed, though they exchanged uneasy glances. They loaded the crates onto a wagon and transported them to Greer's office in the center of town. Greer locked the materials in a back room and spent the next 3 days examining them alone. What he found disturbed him profoundly. The ledgers were financial records meticulously maintained. They documented payments received and disbursements made, organized by date and recipient. The amounts were significant, hundreds of dollars per transaction, enormous sums. For the 1860s, the recipients were identified only by initials or code names. J.P. Richmond, M.S. Lelth, Philadelphia. The journals were more difficult. They were written entirely in cipher, a substitution code that would require significant effort to break. But even without reading the text, Greer could see patterns. Each journal entry began with a date followed by a name, always a girl's name, followed by blocks of encoded text. There were 73 journals covering the period from October 1863 to December 1864. The photographs were the most damning. They showed young girls in various stages of undress, always in the same location, the stone baptistry chamber. Some images showed the girls standing in the pool. Others showed them sitting on the edge, their faces turned toward the camera. A few showed them wrapped in towels, their eyes downcast. The photographs were not overtly obscene, but there was something deeply wrong about them. The clinical precision of their composition, the way the subject seemed simultaneously present and absent. Greer was no detective, but he understood what he was looking at. This was documentation evidence, not of a single crime, but of something systematic. He spent 2 days debating what to do. Part of him wanted to burn everything and forget he'd ever found it. The war was over. The South was still crawling out of its ruins, stirring up a scandal about a dead reverend and missing girls from 25 years ago, would accomplish nothing except to hurt people who were barely surviving as it was. But another part of him, the part that had worn a Union uniform and believed in the rule of law, couldn't let it go. On March 25, 1889, Thomas Greer brought the materials to the county sheriff. Sheriff Raymond Collar was 61 years old and had held his position since 1872. He was a practical man, cautious by nature, and deeply aware that his job was mostly about maintaining order in a town that had very little left to lose. When Thomas Greer walked into his office carrying 2 heavy crates and wearing an expression like someone who'd found a body, Colla's first instinct was to send him away. But Greer was persistent. "You need to see this," he said, setting the crates on Collar's desk. "All of it. And then you need to decide whether you're going to do something about it." Collar spent the next hour examining the contents of the crates. He looked through the ledgers, frowning at the coded entries. He flipped through several journals without comprehension. Then he reached the photographs and his expression changed. He set them down carefully as if they might burn his hands. "Where did you find these?" he asked. "The old Methodist church locked in the baptistry chamber. And you're sure they're from when Webb was there? Look at the dates on the ledgers, 1863 to 1865, and the photographs. Look at the background, that's the baptistry. I just tore the place down, I recognized the walls." Collar sat back in his chair. He was silent for a long time, staring at nothing. Finally, he spoke. "Josiah Webb left Harrodsville in 1866. That's 23 years ago. Most of the people who were here during the war are dead or gone. The girls in these photographs, if they're still alive, would be in their 40s now. What exactly do you expect me to do?" "Find them," Greer said. "Find out what happened to them. Investigate." "Investigate what?" A preacher who conducted unusual baptisms. That's not a crime. Then explain the ledgers. Explain why he was receiving hundreds of dollars and sending it to people in other states. Explain why he kept photographs of half-naked girls in a locked room. Kerr rubbed his face. You're asking me to dig up a scandal that will ruin what's left of this town's reputation. The Methodist Church was the only thing holding people together during the war. If I start making accusations about Webb, 14 girls disappeared from that church, Greer interrupted. I've been asking around. People remember. They vanished between 1863 and 1864. All of them orphans. All of them within months of Webb's baptism ceremony. Abigail Tinsley tried to raise the alarm at the time. No one listened. Tinsley's been dead for over a decade. Doesn't mean she was wrong. Collar stared at the photographs again, his jaw tightened. Give me a week, he said finally. I'll see what I can find. He started by locating anyone still alive who had been part of Webb's congregation during the war. There weren't many. Most of the families had scattered after 1865, chasing work or trying to outrun their memories, but a few remained. Old people now living in the same houses they'd occupied before the cannons came. Collar spoke to a woman named Iris Pennington, 74 years old, who had attended Webb's church regularly. She remembered the purification ceremonies. It caused a stir, she said, sitting in her parlor with a blanket over her knees. Some people thought it was improper, but Reverend Webb was very convincing. He said it was necessary for the girl's spiritual recovery, and his wife was there the whole time, so it seemed acceptable. Do you remember any of the girls who went through it? Pennington's face clouded. I remember some of them. Sarah Rudolph, Martha Good. There were others, but I can't recall all the names. They were quiet girls, traumatized poor things. The war did terrible things to children. What happened to them? They left. Reverend Webb said he'd found placements for them, families willing to take them in or jobs in cities. We were grateful. There were so many mouths to feed. Did anyone ever hear from them again? Letters, visits? Mrs. Pennington shook her head slowly. Not that I know of, but that wasn't unusual. People lost touch during those years. Everything was chaos. Ka asked the same questions to 4 other elderly congregants. Their answers were consistent. The girls had undergone Webb ceremony, then disappeared shortly after, supposedly placed with families or given employment elsewhere. No one had followed up. No one had questioned it. He also managed to locate 2 women who had been girls themselves during the war, living in the church's dormitory, but who had not undergone the purification ceremony. One of them, now a 40-year-old mother of 5 named Clara Brennan, remembered the baptistery with a shudder. They never let us near it, she said. Reverend Webb kept it locked all the time, but we could hear things sometimes, water splashing, voices. One night, I heard someone crying real soft coming from below the church. When I asked about it the next morning, Reverend Webb said I'd been dreaming, but I wasn't. Why didn't you go through the ceremony? Kerr asked. Clara's face hardened. My aunt was still alive. She came and got me before Webb could baptize me. She didn't trust him. She said there was something wrong with a man who needed to see young girls naked to save their souls. Kola took extensive notes. Then he turned his attention to the ledgers. Breaking the code was beyond his abilities, so he brought them to a former Army quartermaster named Louis Briner, who lived in Richmond and had a reputation for being good with ciphers. Briner studied the journals for 2 days before returning them with a partial translation. It's not complicated, Briner said. Simple substitution cipher, each letter replaced by another. Once you figure out the pattern, the rest follows, but you're not going to like what it says. He handed Kola several pages of translated text. Collar read them standing in Briner's office, and with each line, his face grew darker. The journals were detailed accounts of each baptism ceremony. They described the girls, their ages, physical characteristics, emotional states. They documented what Webb said to them, how they responded, how long the ceremonies lasted. They noted whether the girls cried, whether they resisted, whether they seemed to accept what was happening. The entries were clinical, observational, written in the detached tone of someone conducting an experiment. There was no overt confession of sexual assault, but the implication was clear in the level of detail, in the way Webb described the girls' bodies, in his notes about which girls were suitable and which were not. And at the end of each entry was a notation placed or retained or transferred. Collar felt sick. He asked Brenner to continue translating, and over the following week the full scope of what Webb had documented became clear. Of the 73 girls who had undergone the purification ceremony, 14 had been transferred. The journals didn't explain what that meant, but the ledgers did. Referencing the dates, Collar found corresponding payments, large sums of money, received from individuals identified only by initials, along with destination cities Richmond, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New Yorker, had worked enough criminal cases to recognize what he was looking at. This wasn't just abuse, this was trafficking. Webb had used his position as a Reverend and the chaos of the civil war to identify vulnerable girls, isolate them, exploit them, and then sell them. The receiving parties were never named directly, but the pattern was clear. They were wealthy men in northern cities, paying for young girls to be delivered to them. The money went to Webb, who recorded every transaction with the precision of a businessman. Just when it seemed the evidence couldn't become more damning, Collar discovered something else. Tucked into the back of one of the ledgers was a folded letter written in a different hand. It was dated July 1864 and addressed to Reverend W. The letter read, "Your latest delivery arrived in satisfactory condition. The girl is as described and has been placed accordingly. Payment is enclosed. I have additional buyers interested in similar acquisitions. Ages 131-15, preferred fair complexion, docile temperament. Can you supply 3 more by autumn? Double your usual rate if they meet specifications." It was signed J. Peyton, Richmond. Collar sat in his office and stared at that letter for a long time. Then he locked everything in his safe and began trying to figure out what to do next. If you're finding this investigation as disturbing as Sheriff Collar did, take a moment to reflect on how many similar stories might be hidden in the archives of history waiting to be uncovered. If this kind of historical mystery grips you, hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical tales, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. The next part of this investigation will take us into the darkest corners of Civil War-era crime, and you won't want to miss it. Now let's continue. Sheriff Collar faced an impossible situation. He had evidence of crimes committed 25 years earlier by a man who was likely dead. The victims were scattered or deceased. The buyers, the men who had paid for the girls, were protected by time, distance, and almost certainly by wealth and influence. There was no practical path to justice, but there was truth, and Collar believed that mattered. He spent 2 weeks attempting to track down Josiah Webb. The trail was surprisingly easy to follow. Webb had indeed been reassigned to a church in North Carolina in 1866, just as he'd claimed. But he'd stayed there less than a year before moving to Tennessee, then Kentucky, then Arkansas. He seemed to drift from congregation to congregation, never staying long in any one place. The pattern was telling. In each location, Webb would arrive with strong references, take over a struggling church, work for 12 to 18 months, then quietly move on. Collar sent telegrams to local authorities in each town asking if there had been any reports of missing children or unusual behavior during Webb's tenure. 3 sheriffs wrote back with stories that made Collar's stomach turn. In Tennessee, 2 orphan girls had disappeared from Webb's church in 1868. In Arkansas, a girl had accused Webb of improper conduct during a private prayer session, but the accusation had been dismissed as slander. In Kentucky, Webb's departure had been sudden and unexplained following rumors of irregularities that were never formally investigated. The Methodist Episcopal Church itself had no record of disciplinary action against Webb. He had simply moved from post to post, leaving before anyone could build a case against him. Kerr finally located Webb in November of 1889. He was living in a boarding house in Little Rock, Arkansas, no longer serving as a minister. He was 79 years old and in failing health. Collar traveled there by train, bringing a deputy and copies of the ledgers. They found Webb in a second-floor room that smelled of old sweat and medicine. He was in bed, propped up by pillows, his face the color of old paper. His hands shook with palsy. When Collar identified himself and explained why he was there, Webb's expression didn't change. "I wondered when someone would come," he said. His voice was thin but steady. "I'm surprised it took this long." Kerr placed the ledgers on the bed. "I need you to explain these." Webb looked at them without touching them. "What is there to explain?" "They're records. I kept good records." "Records of what?" of placements. I found homes for girls who had no homes. I helped them. You sold them. Webb's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. I facilitated arrangements. There were men of means who were willing to take in orphans. I simply connected supply with demand. The girls were fed, clothed, given shelter, better than they would have had otherwise. You baptized them naked. I purified them. They needed purification. The war had stained them. You documented everything. 73 journals, photographs. Webb closed his eyes. I am a methodical man, Sheriff. I always have been. If I was going to do something, I was going to do it correctly with proper records. Do you understand what you're admitting to? I understand that I'm dying. I have perhaps 2 months left, according to the doctor. You can arrest me if you like, but I doubt I'll live long enough to stand trial. And even if I do, who will testify? The girls, they're scattered across half the country. The buyers, they're respectable men. They'll deny everything. My wife, she's been dead for 24 years. Kara felt a wave of rage so intense he had to step back from the bed. You used your position as a minister to abuse and sell children. I used my position to survive, Webb said, opening his eyes. Do you know what it was like during the war? Do you have any idea how hard it was to keep a church running with no money, no food, no support? The Methodist Church abandoned us. The Confederate government collapsed. The Union didn't care. I had 200 refugees depending on me, and I had nothing to give them. So, I found a way, and yes, I benefited. But so did those girls. They would have died otherwise, starved or worse. You're trying to justify. I'm not justifying anything, Webb interrupted. I'm telling you what happened. I saw an opportunity. I took it. I knew it was wrong. I knew I would answer for it eventually. And here you are. But you're too late, Sheriff. Far too late. Collar wanted to put his hands around the old man's throat. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room. His deputy followed, looking shaken. They arrested Webb anyway, though it was purely symbolic. He was extradited back to Virginia in December of 1889, more for the appearance of justice than any real expectation of trial. He died in the county jail on January 9, 1890, before formal charges could be filed. The official cause of death was pneumonia. His death left Kara with no one to prosecute, but he still had the records and he still had 14 names. He spent the next 6 months trying to find the girls who had disappeared from Harrodsville's Methodist Church. It was slow, difficult work. Most of them had been orphans with no families to track them. The buyers had used false names or avoided documentation entirely. But Cola was persistent and he had resources now. He'd gotten the Virginia state government interested in the case, and they'd provided funding for a proper investigation. By June of 1890, he'd located 3 of the 14. The first was a woman named Sarah Ruddled, the same Sarah who had been the first to undergo Webb's ceremony. She was 41 years old and living in Baltimore working as a seamstress. When Collar found her, she refused to speak to him. She stood in the doorway of her small apartment and said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I was never in Virginia. You have the wrong person." He showed her the photograph from the Baptistery. She looked at it, and something broke in her face. Then she closed the door. The second was a woman named Martha Good found in Philadelphia. She had married and taken her husband's surname. When Collar explained who he was and why he'd come, she invited him inside and told him everything. She had been sold to a factory owner named James Pritchard, who had kept her as a domestic servant and mistress for 3 years. When she turned 18, he'd grown tired of her and turned her out. She'd survived by working in textile mills, eventually met a decent man, and built a life. She had never reported what happened because she believed no one would care. "Do you want to press charges?" Collar asked. Martha laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Against who? Pritchard's dead. Webb's dead. What would be the point? It won't change what happened. It won't give me back those years." The third was a woman named Eleanor Hayes found in New York. She had become a prostitute. When Collar located her, she was dying of tuberculosis in a charity hospital. She told him that she'd been sold to a man in New York who had used her until she was 16, then sold her to a brothel. She'd been there ever since. "I knew what Webb was doing," she said, her voice barely audible. "Even before the ceremony, I could see it in his eyes, but I had nowhere else to go. And when he told me I'd have a home, I wanted to believe him. I was 14. I wanted to believe someone would save me." She died 2 days after Cola's visit. Collar wrote a full report on the case and submitted it to the state government in August of 1890. The report detailed everything: the discovery of the journals and ledgers, the coded entries, the photographs, the testimony from the 3 survivors he'd located, and the pattern of Webb's movements over 2 decades. He recommended a formal inquiry into the Methodist Episcopal Church's oversight practices and suggested that law enforcement in other states be notified to search for additional victims. The report was filed and forgotten. The state government had no interest in pursuing a scandal involving a dead reverend and crimes from the Civil War era. The Methodist Church declined to comment. The newspapers that reported the story treated it as a curiosity. Ministers' secret archives revealed dark past and moved on to more pressing matters after a week. The 11 other girls were never found. Their fates remain unknown. The physical evidence of Josiah Webb's crimes was dispersed and largely destroyed. Thomas Greer, disturbed by what his demolition had uncovered, spent 3 sleepless nights staring at the photographs before making his decision. He couldn't bring himself to simply discard them. They were evidence after all, proof of what had happened, but neither could he bear to keep them. On a cold morning in April 1890, he built a fire in the iron stove behind his office and fed the photographs into the flames one by one, watching as the faces of those long gone girls curled and blackened and turned to ash. He kept only 5 images sealed in an envelope marked Evidence Webb Case, which he delivered to Sheriff Collar with instructions to use them only if necessary for prosecution. When Webb died before trial, those 5 photographs joined the rest of the case materials in Kerr's office safe. Sheriff Kerr kept the journals and ledgers as official evidence, storing them in reinforced file boxes in the county records room. He had them inventoried and cataloged, cross-referenced with his investigation notes, convinced that even if justice couldn't be served now, perhaps future generations would want to know what had happened. He was wrong about that. When he retired in 1895, his successor, a younger man named Albert Ducker, who had no connection to the case and no interest in relitigating old scandals, saw the Webb materials as nothing more than a shameful embarrassment to the county. The boxes were transferred to the state archives in Richmond with minimal documentation, misfiled under religious records, miscellaneous, and promptly forgotten. In 1903, a burst pipe in the archives basement sent 3 feet of water flooding through the storage area. The Webb journals and ledgers, along with thousands of other documents, were reduced to pulp. A junior clerk later reported the water damage in a brief memo noting that various materials of questionable historical value had been lost. No one investigated further. The baptistry chamber itself was filled in with rubble when the church demolition was completed in the summer of 1889. Greer's crew shoveled broken timber, shattered slate, and chunks of stone into the underground room, until it was level with the foundation, then covered everything with tuft of dirt. The land was subdivided into 3 parcels and sold to families moving in from neighboring counties, people who saw only opportunity in cheap property near the main road. By 1895, 3 small houses had been built on the site. Modest structures with vegetable gardens and chicken coops. None of the families who moved into those houses knew what had been there before, or what had happened in the stone chamber beneath their feet. Years later, one of the homeowners, a farmer named Walter Quinn, reported that his well water sometimes tasted strange, slightly metallic, and that his wife complained of bad dreams when the wind blew from the east. But these were dismissed as the ordinary complaints of country life, nothing more. Mrs. Abigail Tinsley's records, the lists of names and dates she had kept during the war, along with her notes about conversations with the disappeared girls, remained in her sister's attic until 1912, when the house was sold after the sister's death. The trunk containing the papers was purchased at auction for $2 by a local school teacher named Helen Vernell, who found the documents interesting, but couldn't verify their accuracy. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read. The pages were brittle with age, and there was no way to confirm whether the names listed had ever actually existed. Vernell kept the papers for several years as a curiosity, occasionally showing them to colleagues who found them morbidly fascinating, but ultimately useless as historical evidence. In 1918, feeling that the materials deserved preservation, even if their authenticity was questionable, she donated them to the County Historical Society, where they were cataloged under unverified personal accounts, Civil War era, and placed in storage. A notation in the catalog read, "Possible fabrication or embellishment. Use with caution." The documents were never displayed, never studied, and eventually forgotten as the Historical Society's collection grew and priorities shifted toward more verifiable artifacts. The town of Harrodsville continued its slow decline through the turn of the century. By 1900, fewer than 200 people remained, mostly elderly residents too poor or too stubborn to leave. The arrival of a railroad spur in 1903 brought brief hope of revitalization. There was talk of a new grain elevator, a hotel, perhaps even a small factory, but the hoped-for investment never materialized. The railroad company had overextended itself, and the spur to Harrodsville proved unprofitable. By 1910, passenger service had been discontinued. By 1920, the tracks were torn up for scrap metal. The town withered accordingly. The general store closed in 1915. The post office was downgraded to rural road delivery in 1923. By 1930, Harrodsville existed only as a name on maps, a scattered collection of farms connected by dirt roads. Today, it's little more than a crossroads with a gas station and a historical marker that makes no mention of the Methodist Church or what happened there. The location of the old church property is unmarked, overgrown with Virginia pine and honeysuckle. Most people who live in the area have no idea it ever existed, and those who do know something of its history speak of it only vaguely as that place where something bad happened during the war without specifics or details. Of the 3 survivors Sheriff Collar located, only Martha Good lived past 1900. Sarah Rudel, the seamstress in Baltimore who had refused to speak about her past, died in 1897 of complications from influenza. She left no will, no family, no record of her life beyond census entries and city directories. Ella Hayes, the woman dying of tuberculosis in the New York Charity Hospital, passed away 2 days after Collar's visit. As noted previously, Martha Good in 1923 at the age of 74. She had married a railroad clerk named Thomas Brennan in 1871, born 5 children, and lived what appeared from the outside to be an unremarkable life in a working-class neighborhood of Philadelphia. Her children remembered her as a stern but loving mother who insisted on education, who saved every penny, and who never under any circumstances attended church. When her husband once pressed her on this, he was a casual Presbyterian who enjoyed the social aspects of Sunday services. She told him quietly, but firmly, that she'd had enough religion to last several lifetimes. He never asked again. She never told him about Harrodsville, about the Baptistery, about Josiah Webb. When she died, her daughter found a small locked box among her possessions. Inside was a single photograph, not one of Webb's, but a formal portrait taken sometime in the 1880s, showing Martha as a young woman with 3 other women of similar age, all of them staring at the camera with serious expressions. On the back, in Martha's handwriting, were 4 names: Sarah, Eleanor, Martha, and the others we never found. The daughter didn't understand the reference and eventually discarded the photograph when she cleaned out her mother's house. It's lost now, like so much else. The 11 other girls who disappeared between 1863 and 1864 left no trace beyond their names in Webb's ledgers and Mrs. Tinsley's lists. Their fates are unknown and at this distance unknowable. They may have survived and built lives under different names. Married men who never learned where they came from, raised children who never knew their grandmother's stories. They may have died young, discarded by the men who bought them when they were no longer useful or attractive. They may have ended up in circumstances so terrible that survival itself became a daily battle they eventually lost in brothel, in factories, in back rooms of tenement buildings where no one asked questions. Some may have simply vanished into the anonymous masses of post-war America. One more wave of displaced people in a nation that was remaking itself and had no time for the casualties of that remaking. Without names, without graves, without anyone to remember them, they became ghosts in the truest sense, present only as absences, as gaps in the historical record, as the empty spaces between the documented lives of others. Josiah Webb left no confession, no expression of remorse, no final accounting of his crimes beyond what Sheriff Collar had extracted during that single interview in Little Rock. His final words, recorded by a jail guard named Peter Mullaney, who was present when Webb died, were, "I did what was necessary." Mullany later told a reporter that Webb had seemed neither afraid nor repentant in his final hours, merely tired, as if death were just another administrative task to be completed. Webb was buried in the Little Rock City Cemetery in an unmarked grave in the poorest section. No service was held, no one attended. The Methodist Episcopal Church, when asked for comment by a Little Rock newspaper, issued a brief statement saying that Webb had been defrocked posthumously, and that his actions in no way reflected the values of our denomination. The statement was published once and never referenced again. The men who purchased the girls, the buyers identified only by initials in Webb's ledgers, were never investigated. Sheriff Collar had tried briefly to identify them, but the trails were cold and the clues too vague. J.P. Richmond could have been any of 24 prominent men with those initials living in Virginia's capital during the 1860s. M.S. Lell might have been a factory owner in Massachusetts, but Lell was a textile city with hundreds of mills and thousands of workers, and no one was going to start asking questions about which wealthy men might have purchased young girls 30 years earlier. Most of the buyers were likely prominent citizens protected by wealth, social position, and the passage of time. Their crimes, if crimes they were in the legal sense, died with them, absorbed into the respectable legacies they left behind. Their descendants, if they had descendants, lived today with no knowledge of what their ancestors did, no stain on their family names, no reason to question the sources of their inherited wealth. What remains is a question that Sheriff Carr wrestled with until his own death in 1901. How many others were there? Webb's journals covered only the Harrodsville Church, only the period from 1863 to 1865, but he had served congregations for decades before the war. His first ministerial appointment was in 1835 when he was just 26 years old, and he continued moving from church to church for years afterward, leaving trails of rumor and suspicion, but never quite enough evidence to warrant formal investigation. If he was willing to document his activities in Harrodsville with such meticulous detail, keeping 73 journals and maintaining financial ledgers that tracked every transaction, had he done the same elsewhere? And if so, where were those records? Collar spent his retirement years writing letters to sheriffs and church officials across the South, asking if anyone had ever investigated similar disappearances or found similar documentation. He received few responses, and those he did receive were discouraging. One sheriff in Tennessee wrote back, "Reverend Webb's time here was troubled, but the records were destroyed in a fire. Without evidence, there is nothing to pursue." Another from Kentucky was more blunt. "The war took everything. Whatever happened then stays buried. No point in digging it up now." In 1907, that question became even more impossible to answer. A fire destroyed the boarding house in Little Rock where Webb had died. The blaze started in the kitchen late at night and spread rapidly through the old wooden structure. 4 residents died, including an elderly man who had been living in Webb's former room on the 2nd floor. Everything in that room was incinerated: furniture, personal effects, and whatever papers or books the current occupant might have possessed. The fire marshal's report made no mention of documents or records, but then again, no one was looking for them. If there were additional journals, additional ledgers, additional evidence of other victims in other towns spanning 5 decades of ministry, they were lost in that fire. Or perhaps they had been destroyed years earlier, deliberately burned by Webb himself before his final illness, a careful man tidying up loose ends. Or perhaps they never existed at all, and Harrodsville was the only place where Webb had acted on impulses that he'd successfully suppressed elsewhere. There's no way to know. The question hangs in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to dispel. The story of the Reverend who baptized girls naked, and what really happened in that baptistery, is one of those historical horrors that surfaces briefly and then sinks back into obscurity. It appeared in a handful of newspapers in 1889 and 1890, was discussed in shocked whispers in churches across Virginia and beyond, and then faded from public consciousness as newer scandals and crises demanded attention. It's a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like ministers, standing in pulpits speaking words of comfort to the grieving and hope to the desperate. Sometimes they use the language of salvation to justify damnation, wrapping exploitation in theology so convincing that even their victims struggle to name what's being done to them. Sometimes they keep meticulous records of their sins, not out of guilt or any impulse toward confession, but out of pride in their efficiency, their organization, their ability to manage complex operations under difficult circumstances. And sometimes, no matter how much evidence exists, no matter how clear the pattern of abuse, justice arrives too late to matter. The perpetrator dies before trial. The victims scatter or disappear or choose silence over the shame of public testimony. The institutions that enabled the crimes protect themselves by destroying records and issuing bland denials. The community that should have known better, should have acted sooner, convinces itself that it couldn't have known, couldn't have prevented what happened. Everyone finds ways to absolve themselves, and the truth gets buried under layers of deliberate forgetting. The girls who survived carried their trauma silently, knowing that the world would judge them more harshly than it would judge the man who had sold them. They were damaged goods, ruined girls, unmarriageable except to men who didn't know their histories. They learned to lie about their pasts, to construct new identities, to bury the memories so deep that sometimes even they could almost forget. The girls who didn't survive left no graves, no memorials, no acknowledgement that they ever existed at all. They became statistics without names, absences that no one bothered to explain, casualties of a war that had produced so many casualties that a few more orphaned girls barely registered. In the end, what happened in Harrodsville between 1863 and 1865 wasn't an aberration. It was a reflection of what war does to human beings. When all the normal structures of society collapse, when survival becomes the only moral law that matters, when the vulnerable have no protection except the mercy of those in power. And mercy, as those 14 girls discovered, was always in short supply. People who might have intervened chose not to see. People who suspected something was wrong decided it was none of their business. People who had the power to investigate found it easier to look the other way. The machinery of exploitation operated smoothly because everyone involved directly or indirectly had reasons to let it continue. Webb provided a service that some people wanted, and that others were willing to tolerate as the cost of keeping order during chaos. The girls paid the price for that tolerance. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was truly revealed, or are there even darker secrets still buried in the records of the Civil War? How many other Josiah Webbs operated in the shadows of that conflict, using positions of trust to exploit the desperate and vulnerable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this historical investigation compelling, subscribe to Dark Diaries. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our explorations of America's darkest, forgotten chapters. Share this video with someone who appreciates the grim truths hidden in history. These are the stories that rarely make it into textbooks, the ones that linger in the shadows, waiting for someone to listen. And as long as you keep searching, we'll keep bringing you the mysteries that history tried to erase. Until next time, remember the past is full of stories like this, stories that were deliberately buried, stories that challenge our comfortable assumptions about who we were and what we're capable of becoming. Some truths refuse to stay hidden, no matter how much time passes. See you in the next investigation.